Hello everyone, and thank you for tuning in once again to the Black Box Podcast, BBOR, Black Box Online Radio, coming to you from West Virginia. Okay, now today we're going to be discussing the case of Billie Jo Jenkins. I was hoping that at least one week on the channel we could do a true crime Q&A where I read off some of your comments and then we have a little bit of a discussion about what's going on. And Billie Jo Jenkins is an interesting case because I've done a variety of uploads. I have 5 previous uploads on the case, and we discussed a variety of suspects. We discussed a variety of possibilities, but all of the questions and comments are all coming back to one specific person, and that would be Billie Jo's foster father, Sean Jenkins. And I also really need to kind of preface this by saying that we're, of course, talking about the 1997 murder when a young girl named Billie Jo Jenkins was found murdered, beaten to death with a metal 10 spike, and the prime suspect became her foster father, Sean. Once again, this is coming to us from Hastings, England. What I would also would find that somewhat relevant to this discussion right now is that I covered a variety of suspects. I covered a variety of angles on the case. However, every single comment that I have received is not only talking about Sean Jenkins, but indicating that they believe he is guilty. So if we're going to look at something like that, well, I would say people on the internet are very passionate about Sean Jenkins and his guilt in the 1997 murder of his foster daughter, Billie Jo Jenkins. You know, Sean Jenkins is a very bizarre, complicated individual, and by that I mean he's just weird. I don't necessarily mean he's like complicated in the intellectual sense. No, I think he's weird. I think he has a weird way of talking, and that's not doing him any favors. He's definitely a sketchy, shady person, but let's get right to the comments. Our first one comes to us from Vordman. Vordman says, Sean Jenkins is guilty as hell. Mr. B, the person that I mentioned, another one of the suspects, is Mark Linham. He was over a mile away when the murder happened. I can't believe anyone has doubts. And thank you actually for this comment because one of the largest suspects in the case of Billie Jo Jenkins was not only Sean Jenkins but also a mentally ill man who was referred to as Mr. B. Some YouTubers even call him Mr. X. I'm not sure if the police were actually using that name. And what they were trying to say is that this individual could have possibly been following Billie Jo. I'm pretty sure that we did have at least one instance when Billie Jo made a comment to someone that she thought a man was following her, and a lot of people perceive that to be Mr. B and or Mark Linham, as he's now been identified. There's also something very interesting about him that he had a fascination with plastic, and he was like supposedly earlier that on the day of the murder of Billie Jo Jenkins, Mr. B was seen smelling a piece of plastic, and Billie Jo was found with a piece of a plastic bag or a bin liner up her nostril when the body was found. However, my honest gut feeling with that is I think that that is probably a little bit fabricated. I don't genuinely believe that somebody saw this individual Linham with smelling a piece of plastic earlier. It sounds like someone probably kind of concocted that story. There's just something that comes across as a red flag with that it doesn't sound very genuine. But what Vordman is saying is that this individual, whom he identified by name, which I never did, I mean, in almost all the print sources, he's referred to as Mr. B simply, but he's actually saying his name is Mark Linham, and he was over a mile away, and this was corroborated by witnesses. It's very unlikely that Mr. B talked about this. And furthermore, as I mentioned in some of the Devil's Advocate episodes about Billie Jo Jenkins, that if we were going to look at Mr. B as a suspect, no definitive proof that he was ever in the house. No definitive proof. No physical evidence to support that. Zero, zilch, nada, niente. There is no physical evidence to tie Mark Linham to this crime. I mean, and I do admit, though, Sean Jenkins is someone who was in the house that time. Sean Jenkins was left alone with Billie Jo around that time. We do have those things to bear in mind. So, as I believe I replied to Vordman actually, and I just said 99%. I rule out Mr. B, Mark Linham, as a potential suspect in this particular murder. Well, then, if this guy didn't do it, if Mr. B, Mark Linham, didn't commit this murder, well, then who did? Let's move to our next comment. Colin Flowers had a comment about how Sean Jenkins, had such little blood on him. Because I was actually asking the open challenge. This guy, Sean Jenkins, would have had about 3 minutes to murder his foster daughter, and she was struck in the head multiple times with an 18-inch 10 spike. And the people who are advocating for the Sean Jenkins murder theory believe that she was struck in the head with this 10 spike, and that the blood came onto Sean, right? And that he was able to commit the murder, put the piece of plastic into her nostril, and then clean up. I do insist, clean up, and then come back to his daughters. And I was like, well, how was he able to commit this crime with such little blood on him? Colin Flowers writes, he had enough blood on him. Also mixed in were flesh and bone. People say he was prone to violent outbursts. Well, I'm going to say firstly, Colin is completely correct. This was not only blood that was found on Sean's fleece. There were also bone fragments. This is the first time I've heard someone say that there was flesh, but I mean, what I would attribute to, even if there were, micro flesh particles, what we have to say about that is Billie Jo was struck in the head multiple times with a 10 spike. It was not one single time. That was what I originally thought this was. Like, originally I thought that she was just hit once with the 10 spike and that just delivered the fatal blow instantly. And then I was really kind of going down the kind of Sean Jenkins's guilty theory instantly, hook, line, and sinker. But when I learned that she was really severely bludgeoned and struck in the head multiple times, well, that would have, of course, that would have shattered her skull. I mean, there are going to be lots and lots and lots of bone fragments. There would be flesh particles. There would be micro droplets of blood, especially all going around the mouth area. I mean, blood just pours everywhere when someone's struck in the head. And, because the counter argument, the people that believe that Sean Jenkins is innocent are sort of saying that Billie Jo exhaled a post-mortem mist from her mouth, and that's how the micro droplets got on Sean's fleece, because when Sean found Billie Jo, he picked her up and he moved the body. I mean, like, we're talking about just kind of like cradling her in his arms for like a second, not moving it from one place to another. But when he actually came into physical contact with the body, they believed that Billie Jo exhaled a post-mortem mist. And I mean, there is something to say about that. I mean, that is a possibility, and I'm keeping an open mind with all these things. So what we can sort of say with this is that there were actually 158 micro droplets of blood that were found on Sean's fleece, and small microscopic particles of bone. What does this mean? Everything there that was found could not be seen with the naked eye. This stuff had to be pulled up by forensics. You could not see these things with the naked eye. The 158 micro droplets of blood, they could not be seen with the naked eye. I mean, yes, I do admit that there was bone. There were bone fragments that were found on his fleece as well, microscopic bone fragments. But if it indeed came from a bloody mist that Billie Jo was exhaling, I mean, of course that's going to contain bone fragments. Her skull was shattered. Of course it's going to contain flesh fragments. Her skull was shattered. But Colin does say that Sean was prone to violent outbursts. Here's where I agree completely. Yes. There is one allegation that says Billie Jo went to school with a cut on her mouth, and supposedly was done by Sean Jenkins. That's unconfirmed, though. But, when Sean appeared on Trevor McDonald, it was really bizarre because he's like, they ask him, your children all say that you beat them physically. Your children are saying that you discipline them with a stick and a slipper. Did you ever do those things to your children? He's like, no. It's just like, I mean, very bizarre hesitation with that. And I'm not a mind reader, but if I could be at that time, I would be like, it sounds like he's about to say yes. And then he's just like, you can almost hear the Y coming out of his mouth. Yeah, no. Yeah, better not admit to anything. I mean, because that's not really the most outrageous thing to act. I don't know why he would, it's so easy to say that you gave your child a spanking. Maybe even you gave your child a spanking with a slipper, but you just say that you did not use excessive force. However, the thing is, it's just like, I don't know, I don't believe it. And once again, I mean, like, if we're just going to interpret that sort of interview, the Trevor McDonald interview with Shawn Jenkins, I don't believe him for a second when he says that he never, we're talking not a single time, disciplined his children physically, spanking them with a stick or a slipper. He never did that once. I don't believe him. So, I mean, these guys here, Vordman and Colin, okay, you think Sean is guilty? Well, I definitely think he's lying about the physical abuse. I definitely think he's not a truthful person. And on the previous podcast segments, I talked about how we know for a fact that, Sean does have a certain pattern of not telling the truth, and he's not a very truthful person. But that doesn't necessarily make you a murderer. I mean, trying to cover something up, about something that to protect your reputation, that does not necessarily make you a murderer, because we still don't have, an answer to a big question that I put forward, and our next commenter, Will Jackson, will hopefully try to answer it for us. One of the things is, this is not coming from me, mind you, this is coming from Sean's new wife, Tina, who is a nurse, I should say. And, as a nurse, she's somewhat familiar with blood and how, blood can be transferred. And Tina was so insistent upon Sean's innocence that she married him. That's one thing. But the reason why she insisted that Sean was innocent was that he had so little blood on him. And furthermore, I mean, like, that's Tina's exact quote. There's no way he could have committed the crime with such little blood on him. Because, like, 3 minutes after this murder allegedly happened, he would have been walking out to the car and the children would not have seen any blood on him. Moreover, I mean, everything that was found on his fleece was microscopic. So, I mean, I would push back a little on this. He had enough blood on him. I mean, 158 microdroplets that cannot be seen with the human eye. Microscopic bone particles that cannot be seen with the naked eye. I mean, like, you need, like, sort of forensic technology, a microscope or something like that. But what we also want to know is, why was there only a bloody mist on the front of his fleece? What the forensics were saying is that if Sean had been striking Billie Jo with this tent spike, then as he raised it into the air, the bloody mist would have transferred to the back of his fleece. He would have found it on the front side and the back side, especially around the shoulders area. And all of the particles that Billie Jo left on Sean's body, on Sean's fleece rather, were on the front side. Because, it's like, if you were to even just, if you just do the motions with your own hand, if he were swinging forward multiple times, then as he would raise up the metal spike in the air, the particles, the micro droplets of blood would transfer to the backside of his body, and but those things weren't there. What Will Jackson says is that Shawn Jenkins' height is 6'4", and the metal tent spike was 18 inches. Tent peg, actually, sorry, he said tent peg. A cloud of blood was found on Shawn Jenkins' fleece, which he later concealed. There was also blood on his shoes. This is once again the first time I've heard that there was blood on his shoes. We also had Colin saying that there were flesh particles found on Sean's fleece. First time I've heard that as well. I don't doubt either one of you, but I just I mean, I don't necessarily know what to make of that. The height thing, though, I actually think that Will Jackson might be onto something. I mean, I'm not a scientist. I'm not, the forensic examiner, whatever you'd like to call it. But when you have something like this, you have Shawn Jenkins at 6'4", holding an 18-inch 10 spike. What I believe Will is trying to say is just that that's just too wide of a range. That's too tall, too high of a range. That like, maybe if he were much shorter and his arm was actually just closer to his body when he would be striking her, that it would be more likely. Maybe if he had been 5 feet tall, then there would definitely have been blood particles on the back. But because he has such a long reach, and because of the long length of the 10 spike, that the blood just wasn't transferring in that way. It's possible. What I can say is, and I know it's not popular, but after doing some segments on this podcast, I was very surprised at every single comment. I mean, yes, we have many other comments about the case of Shawn Jenkins. Now it's the case of Shawn Jenkins, but every single one was geared toward Shawn Jenkins being guilty. And it's like, that is sort of what a lot of people are going with, but I would say that I'm not convinced. And you actually have Boardman saying, I can't believe anyone has doubts. Well, the reason that they have doubts is, I mean, Will Jackson has provided an interesting explanation about why there was no blood found on his backside, but very, very small time frame to commit the murder. And furthermore, one of the things I was really hoping that people would discuss in the comment sections is the possibility that this was done by a prowler. What Sean Jenkins has provided in his explanation for this whole event is that there was a man in the hallway when the police arrived who was wearing what he said was very smartly dressed. Perhaps he was wearing a suit or something, but he said there was a smartly dressed man in the hallway during the investigation when the police and the ambulance and the paramedics showed up. And that person never gave any statement. That person never said anything to the investigators. There's no record of that person being there. And Sean believes that that's actually the man that murdered Billie Jo. And Sean does say that he spoke to him, and he said that from the start, actually. There was actually a statement that was given to the police, and, or at the very least, in Sean's kind of statement to the police, he mentioned the smartly dressed man. And, I don't necessarily know, but no one is really examining this in the comments left on my uploads that there was the possibility that Billie Jo was killed by a prowler. I do agree. I don't believe it was Mr. B, Mark Linham. I don't believe it was the M25 rapist. It's really just down to the fact, was this done by Sean Jenkins or was this done by just an intruder, a prowler? And we don't necessarily know. I mean, we don't have definitive certainty that it was Sean. And that's one of the things that I think could really be examined with a little more forensic studies, because like, is it possible for the micro droplets of blood to transfer from this metal 10 spike at, like, at the height of 6 feet 4, the same way that they would on a person who is 5 feet tall? Sean is 6 feet 4 inches tall, and he's holding an 18-inch 10 spike. And what Will Jackson is trying to say is just that distance, that type of distance, is just too large for the blood particles and the micro droplets to transfer to Sean's backside, to the backside of his fleece. But I can't really confirm or deny that. I mean, what we can say is a lot. I really just want to know more. Who is this individual that Sean is describing? The smartly dressed man who was possibly in the hallway during the time when the paramedics and the police arrived. Because what it really sounds like is, I think that it is a bit of a stretch to hear that Sean could have committed the murder in 3 minutes, put a piece of plastic up Billie Jo's nose, and then cleaned up completely, and then just out of the door with his daughters to go buy paint thinner. I mean, I'm not completely convinced that he is, but many people here in the comments section are very, very passionate that he is. But we do have to note, though, that there was an entire Free Sean Jenkins movement in the United Kingdom. A lot of people were very passionate. On the other side, they were very certain that Sean Jenkins was not guilty. They really thought that he had been wrongfully convicted, and I did attribute to a few things to that. Firstly, I said Sean is a weird guy. He has a weird personality. The second thing is his behavior on Trevor McDonald might have actually been someone who was just kind of enthusiastic for his own innocence, and he was celebrating the fact that he was out of jail. And, the third thing is, we don't necessarily have we don't have enough physical evidence to really just say that Sean Jenkins, committed this murder to the nth degree, to the, like, at 100%. We don't have that level of certainty because, if there had been something like a bloody shirt that was found concealed, if there had been some bloody piece of clothing that was hidden on the property that belonged to Sean, I would think, instantly, yes, this is the guy. But what we have is 158 micro droplets only on the front side of his body. Although Will Jackson says that they were also found on his shoes. Well, if this is true that Will Jackson says there was blood found on his shoes, and Will Jackson's also saying that this guy was 6'4" and that the blood couldn't transfer to the backside of his body, well, Wouldn't that mean that there shouldn't be any blood on his shoes? Isn't that more symbolic of Billie Jo exhaling a post-mortem mist while Sean is kneeling down beside her? Once again, he didn't move her body from one end of the room to the other, as far as I understand. He just kind of cradled her a little bit in his arms. And wouldn't that make a lot more sense if there was a bloody mist only on the front side of his body and on his shoes? And I really do have to insist a thing about the bone fragments. I mean, if someone is going to be receiving a skull fracture, yes, microscopic bone fragments are going to be in the blood. It's going to flow down toward her mouth region, and when she exhaled that post-mortem mist, it's going to push out blood, bone fragments, and even flesh particles, as Colin Flowers mentioned. I think that's totally normal. And I would say to Will Jackson's comment that that actually probably works in favor of Sean's innocence. If they did find micro droplets on his shoes but not the backside of his fleece, wouldn't that be more symbolic of some Sean kneeling down beside an injured girl as opposed to standing vertically and striking her in the head? I mean, I really do have to insist. If there had been multiple strikes to the head as opposed to one, like, I think that's just a very, very kind of defining moment. If this had been just one strike to the head, I would think that that somewhat supports the possibility that Sean Jenkins was the murderer. You know, he's just lost it. Billie Jo's painting the patio doors in the wrong way. She painted the inside and the outside. I only wanted her to paint the outside, so he just lost it. He picked up an object and he just smacked her with it. It's like, oh crap. But the fact that, there were so many strikes, that would create more blood evidence. That would create more blood evidence on his fleece that Sean would not have known about. Sean wouldn't have known to clean those things because they were microscopic. This blood evidence that people are talking about cannot be seen with the naked eye. Micro droplets are the ones that found on Sean's fleece anyway, were microscopic. They had to be revealed with forensic technology. The bone fragments were also microscopic. So that's kind of giving me the suggestion that Sean didn't do this, and maybe, just maybe, this theory that there was this smartly dressed man that was, kind of blending in with the paramedics and the police officers, and he just kind of tried to just sort of hide in plain sight, and he just blended in with the scene, that he could have actually committed this murder. I don't think Sean Jenkins is a perfect person. I don't even think Sean Jenkins is someone who is a good person. I mean, like, when you have your wife and all the remaining members of your family just fleeing the country, running off to Tasmania, of all places, to get away from you, that's a bad sign. Granted, there is the possibility that they do genuinely believe that he is guilty, and I mean, I'm sure that they would have an enormous amount of questions. But listen here, I am forced to admit one big thing. I cannot prove that there was another man in the house when Billie Jo was murdered around that time. Even if you say that there's some kind of guy wearing a suit with the police and the paramedics, okay, I mean, you can say that all you want. For starters, that's not proof. Secondarily, I can't prove that that guy was there when Billie Jo got murdered. What I can say with certainty is Sean Jenkins was present around the time of Billie Jo's death. He would have had a 3-minute window when he could have possibly committed this murder. He's the only one who was definitively in the house around that time. You have a report of him saying that the smartly dressed man is in the house way after the murder, after you found the body, after this, after that. Did Sean Jenkins just lose it? Ugh. I'm very divided on this, and I've really been divided with a lot of things, but the theory that I can put forward, because on this channel I really like to put forward kind of genuine theories that I believe, as opposed to just playing the opposite sides. The thing that I do believe, 100% now is there is not enough definitive physical evidence to say that Sean Jenkins committed this murder. I would have reasonable doubt. I would. And that's what I can say. And I'm very surprised at every single comment I received on these uploads. And I did 5 of them, but every single comment is about Sean Jenkins and his guilt. Everybody thinks he's guilty. Once again, I don't think that, he is like anyone that we should admire, but I've said it on this channel, and if you've listened to any of my previous uploads, you know what I'm gonna say. Being weird is not a crime. I'm not necessarily sure what's going to happen to the case of Billie Jo Jenkins. Like, is this one that is never going to get solved? I think possibly. Now that Sean has been exonerated, Sean is no longer in prison, and I don't necessarily know if there's going to be someone who is ever going to be tried for this because a lot of the attention really focused on Sean, whereas this person that he talked about, well, I mean, it's such a vague statement. He believes that there was a man in his hallway who was very smartly dressed, and he was kind of just mingling around with the police officers and the paramedics. Like, during that time is when I believe that this man was there, and he spoke to Sean, and Jesus said something like, everything's going to be all right. He said something to that effect. I forget the exact words. At the same time, though, I would say that this is kind of suggestive of the prowler theory. Also, bear in mind, we always need to bear in mind, Sean Jenkins was in a very high crime area. And the whole Jenkins family, all of them, Lois and the children, Billie Jo, they were all living in a very high crime area. They were installing lights, security lights, because it was a high crime area. And if I recall correctly, Billie Jo was actually painting the patio door because there had been a previous break-in attempt. Like someone had tried to break in through the patio door and it had been damaged. High crime area. So what did they do? They left their foster daughter alone, and they went out to get paint thinner. I mean, I do have to admit, yes, they were going out to get paint thinner so the other two girls could join in with the painting. I mean, because Sean had promised him that. But at the same time, you left the girl alone in a high crime neighborhood. Well, what do you think happened? A crime happened. I mean, like, this is not rocket science. This is more like 2 plus 2 equals high crime neighborhood, for goodness sake. And that's exactly what happened. Billie Jo was the victim of a crime. So that was one thing that kind of would support kind of the Sean Jenkins is innocent theory. This was a very high crime neighborhood. Billie Jo had talked about somebody following her in the past who people attributed that to being Mr. B, Mark Linham. What if it wasn't him, though? Because I really think a lot of that stuff about Mr. B was concocted post-mortem of Billie Jo. What if it was indeed a prowler who had been stalking the house? What if it was indeed, somebody else? Oh, I believe she made a comment. Was he wearing a leather jacket or something, the guy that was following Billie Jo? But I don't remember the exact specific detail on that one. What I can say is that Billie Jo is somebody who suffered a horrible tragedy. Billie Jo Jenkins was trying to start a new life with her foster family, and it was a tense household. And I believe that it probably wasn't easy having Sean Jenkins as a foster father. It's like it was a very rough situation. But did he commit the murder? Or did he just make a very critical mistake and left his daughter alone in a high crime neighborhood? Bear in mind that the doors would have been opened, and it's like high crime neighborhood. The door isn't even locked. We know it's not locked because Billie Jo's painting it. So it's like, and she's gonna be inside, outside. Horribly vulnerable area for a high crime neighborhood. It's like you left your, what was she, 13 or something? You left your daughter alone in this very, very high crime neighborhood, painting a door that had been damaged by a potential break-in from a burglar, a vandal, something of that nature. I don't necessarily know what happened that day back in 1997, but what I can say is everyone really looks towards Sean Jenkins. And the last thing that I will say is that Sean is someone who probably is becoming the center of attention because he has a very weird personality. He is bizarre. He's a bizarre person. He has a bizarre manner of speech. He also had the thing, he lied on his resume to get the job. He probably had lots of stress in his life. He, messed up in the grocery store earlier that day. He forgot his checkbook, or his checkbook was blank. It was out of checks. It was empty, so he was having a very hectic day. Did he just snap? Did he just be like, it's like they got into an argument over the patio doors and Sean just grabbed the nearest object? But a big thing that I would say about that is I don't recall the daughters ever mentioning that Sean Jenkins had the metal tent spike in the backyard previously. If they were just like, yeah, that was sitting on the porch, and yeah, that had been there for weeks. But I don't think anyone's ever recalled that specifically, so perhaps, that came from somewhere else, which again would support the prowler theory. But just the last thing to say is just, I'm not 100% certain that Sean did it. Nope. Why do people have doubts? As our first comment was, well, it's an enormously small amount of blood evidence. It is a very small time frame window for him to have committed the murder. Furthermore, there is a sort of another possible suspect in this, that smartly dressed man in the hallway that no one seems to be following up on. Fourthly, they were in a very high crime neighborhood to begin with. Fifthly, Billie Jo was left alone in a high crime neighborhood, and she had even talked about people had possibly been following her. Well, maybe it wasn't Sean. Well, that's the last thing I'll say. What do you think? Please drop a comment below, and thank you so much for listening.